Fabulous. So this morning we're doing the last in our series of the what if. And this morning we're focusing on what if Jesus really did rise from the dead. I don't know about you, but this last weekend has been a momentous occasion occurred. Friday was Black Friday. I'm sure all of us rushed out at 5 o'clock in the morning to hit the shops to get the best deals. No? Anybody dash out this year? No. We have done once in previous years. I sent Barry very early on a morning to Asda one year for a Christmas present for him. I said, "It's your Christmas present. Go out early to Asda." No, I'm just joking. Okay, so it's been Black Friday, the last payday before Christmas. Predictions. Because it's really Black Weekend. The whole weekend's taking over now, isn't it? Predictions are that at the end of this weekend, £5.8 billion will have been spent on the high street, a 4% increase on last year. So when it comes to Black Friday, how do people go about making their purchases? How do they decide? Some of the deals that appear on the internet and in the shops on Black Friday appear to be unbelievable bargains, unbelievable deals. I saw a slow cooker in Tesco yesterday, a very good one for £10. I thought to myself, maybe I should buy a slow cooker. And then I decided, no, I didn't come out for one. I'm going to hold fast and not buy one. So how do we go about making those good deals when they seem a little bit unbelievable? How do we know that we're getting a good deal? Well, we don't unless we do some research first. If you see a good deal on Black Friday, if you see a TV or a, computer or something that looks an unbelievable price, the only way we're going to know it's an unbelievable price is if we research first. If you have a look at the prices in the other shops, if you have a look at the price that it's been on sale for before, if you compare it around and about, and then after you've done all the work, after you've done all the research, after you've done all the comparisons, you discover you're actually getting about £5 off it from the other places. But you have to do the research in order to work out if it really is a good deal. What if we were to apply this theory to the Christian faith? We spent the last few weeks looking at the evidence that Jesus was a historical figure. We've considered arguments on both sides in relation to creation and whether creation was an accident or whether there is a creator, and how and why life exists. We've looked at the issues surrounding suffering in the world and how people can claim in the midst of suffering that there is a God. And today we are coming to the closing argument for the Christian faith. The argument we're going to look at today, what if Jesus really did rise from the dead? The whole of the Christian faith hinges on this. Because if this thing proves to be untrue, all Christians are left with was a man who came and taught and did some amazing things and then died. The end. Finished. No more hope. That man is dead. Buried in his tomb. The Christian message hinges on the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, that he overcame death and hell and sin or wrongdoing, that he overcame all of that. And the Christian faith hinges on that very point. I don't know if you like Sherlock Holmes. Anybody here a Sherlock Holmes fan? Yeah, I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan. I like a mystery. I particularly like the Sherlock Holmes, the more modern one with Benedict Cumberbatch that's on the telly. I particularly like that show, and I particularly like Benedict Cumberbatch. I'm just confessing to you today. Please pray for me. But I love that series of Sherlock Holmes. If you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, watch the newer series. It's fabulous. But Sherlock Holmes says this: when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And we're going to spend a few minutes this morning looking at the claims that Jesus rose from the dead, eliminating the impossible and understanding that however improbable, what we're left with must be the truth. I'm going to read from the Bible for a moment. In John chapter 20, if you have a red Bible, it's page 1089. Just before this passage in John chapter 20, there is another Black Friday. There is a Friday in which this Jesus is taken and crucified on a cross. He's tortured. It's a painful, painful, terrible ordeal to be crucified by the Romans. And this Jesus that we've looked at for these number of weeks now was crucified on the cross. And it says in the Bible that the sky turned black. That was a Black Friday too. 2,000 years ago. The sky turns black. The hope of the disciples, the hope of the Israelite nation, of those who had been following Jesus, was that this Jesus was going to come, overthrow the Romans, and that the world would be changed. And here he is, finally, on the cross, about to die and about to breathe his last. The hope of those disciples is lost as he cries out, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." As he cries out, "It is finished," and dies and breathes his last death. Hope is finished for those disciples because that man had not done the things that they thought he was going to do. So hope is finished. Those disciples go off, hide away, lost, with no leader left to follow, hopeless. Jesus is taken down. He's buried in a tomb, and the stone is rolled. A huge stone is rolled in front of that tomb. And then the Bible says this: early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So Black Friday occurred. Jesus is dead. He's in the tomb. Mary goes off early to the tomb in order to do the things, to mourn, really. She goes off early to the tomb and finds that it is empty. She goes back to the disciples. The tomb is empty. Jesus is not there. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of Christianity. Christians do not believe that his spirit rose from the dead and floated around like a ghost. Christians believe, and the Bible teaches us, that Jesus Christ physically, bodily rose from the dead. And this is the one fact that the whole of Christianity hinges on. The New Testament theologian, the former Bishop of Durham, Tom Wright, said this: "The Christian claim is not that Jesus is to be understood in terms of a God about whom we already know. It is this: the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that the world has a creator, and that the creator is to be seen in terms of, through the lens of Jesus." So what evidence is there that the resurrection really happened? We're going to look at 4 points this morning. For centuries, many of the world's distinguished philosophers have assaulted Christianity as being irrational, superstitious, and absurd. Many have chosen simply to ignore the central issue of resurrection. Others have tried to explain it away through various theories. But the historical evidence cannot just be discounted. And the historical evidence we're going to look at just now. In my house, if I ever get a box of chocolates, which on rare occasions I do, I get a box of chocolates and it's quite a nice treat to have. And I might leave the box of chocolates unattended and disappear off. And eventually, maybe the next morning, I'll get up and I'll go to that box of chocolates and I'll open the lid and there will be the nuts left in there. Anybody else have that problem in their house? There's just the nuts, or maybe you just have the other ones. Maybe you don't like strawberries or something. But there's very little left in that box. And it becomes a mystery to me. Where have my chocolates gone? The fact is, when I went to bed, I'd eaten 2 of those chocolates. You know, I like to savor a box of chocolates, eat it slowly over a little while. I'd taken 2. The next morning, there's probably about 3 or 4 left in the box, the whole box. It's a mystery to me. But something has happened overnight in my home. And so I have to begin to look at the evidence. I have to begin to consider, well, the chocolates didn't melt because they're not still there. There's no melted chocolates in the bottom. The chocolates don't have the ability to get up and walk off by themselves. So something else must have happened to these chocolates. What could it be? And then my mind turns. I've got 3 boys in my house who very much like chocolates. And so I begin to look at them, maybe sniff at them a little bit to see if I can smell chocolate, or to look around their mouths and to decide, did Barry eat them all late at night? Or did Josiah and Simeon get up early and come across the box of chocolates and eat them all? But nevertheless, that box is empty. Therefore, something has to have happened. The first piece of evidence is this: the very fact that the tomb was empty. The disciples of Christ did not go off to Athens or Rome to preach that Christ was raised from the dead. They went right back to the city of Jerusalem, where if what they was teaching was false, the falsity would be evident. The tomb was too notorious to be denied. Paul Althus states this: the resurrection could have not been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. Friends, if I was to go today to Uxbridge, and if I was to go to Uxbridge and say to all those in Uxbridge, in my church today, everyone was sat there, and all of a sudden a miracle happened, and they all disappeared. It's God is at work among us. God's at work among us. The people of Uxbridge, some might think I'm a bit daft. Some might think maybe a miracle did occur. How can we know any different? But what if I was to go and say to Farnham Common, or to those of us that are present, and start spreading a story? Do you remember that Sunday where the church disappeared? You would all say, but that's not true, because we were there and we know and we saw it. So we know it's not true. So the disciples didn't go abroad to preach this message. They went right back to Jerusalem, the place where everyone could test that piece of information. Was the tomb empty? Where they could go to that tomb, and that tomb was well known because the Romans had sealed it. The Romans had sealed it with a stone and put a guard in front of it. Where that tomb was known. And so everybody could have gone to find out and work out that piece of evidence for themselves. Both Jewish and Roman sources and traditions admit an empty tomb. That's not just Christian tradition, it's Jewish tradition as well. Admits an empty tomb. Those resources range from Josephus, who we spoke about a few weeks ago, the historian, to a compilation of 5th century Jewish writings called the Toldoth Jeshua. Dr. Paul Marrier calls this positive evidence from a hostile source, which is the strongest kind of historical evidence. In essence, this means that if a source admits a fact decidedly not in its favour, then that fact is genuine. The Jews had nothing to gain by admitting an empty tomb, nothing, because they didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah anyway. And yet, historical sources and historians, Jewish historians, wrote about the fact of the empty tomb. Gamaliel, who was a member of the Jewish High Court, the Sanhedrin, put forth the suggestion that the rise of the Christian movement was God's doing. He could not have done that if the tomb was still occupied, or if the Sanhedrin knew the whereabouts of Christ's body. Paul Mayer observes that if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude that the sepulchre of Joseph of Arimathea, the tomb in which Jesus was buried, was actually empty on the morning of the first Easter. And no shred of evidence has yet been discovered in literary sources, epigraphy, or archaeology that would disprove this statement. The first fact is this: the tomb was empty on that day. It's not under question from historical sources. We're not still wondering, maybe it was the wrong tomb. Oh, maybe it wasn't empty. Maybe it was just a lie. All historical sources suggest that the fact is the tomb was empty on that day. Like my chocolate box. So therefore something must have occurred. The tomb was empty. What occurred? Someone says that, don't they? What's occurring? I've got a friend who says it. What's occurring? Second, the number 2, this is 1.1. This large stone was moved. The Romans put this large stone. It was a seal. They didn't want Christianity to rise, really. The Jewish people didn't want Christianity to rise. This seal was placed in front, this great big stone in front of the tomb. Therefore, what happened? Because somehow that stone had to be moved. Is it possible that in the middle of the night, these hopeless disciples who were in hiding, who were terrified, who were afraid, who were lost, who were mourning, is it possible that in the middle of the night, they snuck along and moved that huge stone without raising any other noise and raising any other attention to the fact? Is it possible that they did that, bearing in mind there was also a soldier stationed, a Roman guard stationed outside of that tomb? Did the disciples come and fight off the guard and roll away the stone and steal the body? The large stone was moved. The Roman soldier ran away. And Roman soldiers, when they were put in post under pain of death. If they left their post, they would be put to death. And yet this Roman soldier who had been posted at this tomb, something occurred that was so significant that he ran away and left his post that day. The place of the tomb was well known. And some people argue that perhaps they went to the wrong tomb. And I want to argue today, it would be like me taking you to my house and saying to you, this is Buckingham Palace. Stand and look at my house. It's Buckingham Palace. You wouldn't believe me. Why? Because Buckingham Palace is well known. The place of that tomb was well known. It was well documented. The place where the tomb was known. Theories have been put forward to explain the fact that Jesus' body was absent from the tomb that first Easter day, but none are convincing. First, it's been suggested that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that he recovered in some way in the cool of the tomb. I don't know if any of you have seen The Passion, Mel Gibson's The Passion. And in that film, it shows crucifixion. To the best description that probably we've ever really seen. The way that Jesus was flogged, the way his body was completely, skin shed from him, the way that he was put on the cross with the nails, the way that when he died, the spear was placed in his side and blood and water separated had come out. Some people say perhaps Jesus hadn't died. Perhaps when they took him off the cross, he'd just fainted. He was almost dead, but not quite. And when he was in the tomb and he was left, he kind of just came back to life again. Friends, that argument doesn't stand. The Bible says that when he was on the cross, the spear was placed in his side, and when it was, blood and water came out. And that only happens when someone is dead. They had no way of knowing that. Medicine wasn't that advanced in those days. And yet the Bible marks the fact that blood and water separated came out of his body. Jesus was dead. Let me ask you another question. If Jesus came back, if he didn't really die, and he simply came back in the cool of the tomb, would those disciples want to follow him in his brokenness, with his body beaten? Would that be a savior? Would that be a Messiah? Would that bring hope? The argument doesn't stand. A stone weighing 1.5 tons was put in front of the tomb. There's a fascinating piece of evidence in John chapter 19 and verse... Oh, sorry, I've just done that bit. It appears, let me read, go on. It appears that there had been a separation of the clot and serum, which we now know is good medical evidence that he was dead, but they didn't have that medical evidence in the Bible. Sherwin Wright writes this, classical Roman historian. For the New Testament of Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. This guy, this classical Roman historian, is saying the New Testament is a historical document. Historians take the detail as historical. So that detail of the blood and the water coming out of his side is not something made up. It's not under question. It is regarded as a historical fact. Some people said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body and then began a rumor that Jesus was resurrected. Leaving aside the fact that the tomb was guarded, it's psychologically improbable. Here's a depressed, disillusioned group of people who were willing to be tortured and crucified and killed for the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. If they removed his body and hid it, would they really be prepared to die for that belief that Jesus rose from the dead, for that statement, for that lie? It's highly improbable. Others have said maybe the authorities took the body. That's the least problem of all, because if they had the body, when people were saying Jesus has risen from the dead, surely they would say, but we have the body, here he is, to dampen down the rumors. Friends, all of the arguments that have been put to the fact that Jesus didn't really die do not stand. Other people say, well, maybe robbers stole the body, and that's the least likely of all. Because the stone was there, the guard was there. Number 2. If I was to say to you this morning, if I was to get Glenn to stand up here to you today and say to you, ladies and gentlemen, here is Mel Gibson. You be with me? You believe me? No? Because you know what Mel Gibson looks like? You know what Glenn's like? You know that there's a difference, only a slight difference, Glenn, only a slight difference. But yeah, he's got more money. That's the difference. He's got more money than you. Jesus appeared to people after he was placed in the tomb. His physical body appeared to people again. And some people would argue perhaps it was a hallucination. Perhaps 500 people who claimed to have saw him together in one place, perhaps that is a hallucination. Friends, one person can hallucinate. All those people having the same hallucination at the same moment in the same time is massively improbable that it was going to be a hallucination. Could they have brought in a lookalike? People knew this Jesus. People followed him more than the 12. Hundreds of people saw him and met him and walked with him and followed him. People saw Jesus after he had risen from the dead. Jesus stood amongst people and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened like they had seen a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see." Even hostile witnesses claim that Jesus rose from the dead and claim to have saw him. If we look at Paul, Saul of Tarsus, the great persecutor of the Christian people, claims to have seen Jesus Christ, although he had died and was buried. The third piece of evidence is this, the immediate impact. Here were a group of disciples who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding, and something occurred that totally changed them. We've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. This group of disciples went from hiding away in a room of hopelessness, of discouragement, of despair. They went from that to all of a sudden, in an instant, everything changed. They went outside and they began to proclaim, Jesus has risen from the dead. Here he is. And they went about and began to share the story. They were changed. And the fourth piece of evidence is this. The Christian experience down the ages, countless millions of people have experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And perhaps we're all hallucinating. Perhaps we're all deluded. And it's people of every ethnicity, continent, nationality, economic, social, intellectual background from all walks of life are united in this common experience of the risen Jesus Christ. Millions of Christians around the world today experiencing this relationship with him. Friends, my box of chocolates was empty. And because that box of chocolates was empty, something had to have happened. And it was up to me to do the research to get to the bottom of it. This tomb was empty. It's not under question that the tomb was empty. And therefore, it is up to you and I to decide and to discover what has occurred. And for me, friends, when I look at all the evidence, and there is much more you can look at than I have time to talk about today, when we look at all of the evidence, for me, none of it makes sense. And therefore, when I have eliminated the impossible, what I am left with, however improbable, is that this man, Jesus Christ, who died on a cross and was placed in a tomb with a stone guarded by a Roman soldier, that this man, Jesus Christ, actually physically rose from the dead. That is the only place that all of this evidence can bring us to. Professor Thomas Arnold, in his famous book, History of Rome, said this: I have been used for many years to study the histories of other times and to examine and weigh the evidence of those who have written about them. And I know of no one fact in the history of mankind, which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer, that the great sign which God hath given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead. Brooke Foss, an English scholar, wrote this: raking all the evidence together, it is not too much to say that there is no historic incidents better or more visibly supported than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Nothing but the antecedent's assumption that it must be false could have suggested the idea of deficiency in the proof of it. And one more, Professor of Classics at Auckland University, E.M. Blaylock, says this: I claim to be a historian. My approach to classics is historical, and I tell you that the evidence for the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ is better authenticated than most of the facts of ancient history. Friends, we live in a world in which our neighbours and our friends and our family will tell us that to be a Christian is simply a matter of faith. It is simply a matter of being deluded into believing somehow that there is a God, that there is no actual historical evidence for this Christian faith, that there is no premise on which it can stand. And yet, friends, when we have looked over the last number of weeks at the evidence, we are left with the conclusion that there is ample historical evidence to support the fact that 2,000 years ago a man walked this earth whose name was Jesus, to support the fact that he died on a cross and there was an empty tomb. And we now discover that there is ample evidence to support the fact that Jesus Christ physically, bodily rose from the dead and walked upon this earth again. C.S. Lewis writes this: we are faced then with a frightening alternative. The man we are talking about was and is just what he said, or else insane, or something worse. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. And in there, friends, there is a great hope for you and I. You see, we don't just believe because one day we woke up and our brains decided to believe. We believe because there is more than ample evidence And you and I need not be afraid when we talk to our friends and our neighbours and those who don't yet believe, because the Christian faith holds itself. The historical evidence holds the Christian faith up. But the fact is that our friends and neighbours don't understand, because they haven't quite decided to look into it. And so most people that we know will go about through ignorance. And yet we have this great hope to bring to them. Can I encourage you this Christmas time, as you send out your Christmas cards, as you have your Christmas parties, as you get together with people you've maybe not seen for years, let me encourage you to be bold in this Christian faith that we have in Jesus Christ. We don't come to them with empty belief. We come to them with something firm, something very, very firm on which we can stand. So friends, we're going to pray together just now. The tomb was empty.